Hello, my name is Imara Jones, and I am the host of a new weekly program called The Last Sip, which airs on Free Speech TV. And one of the core beliefs of that weekly program is that the solutions to our most pressing problems already exist in the communities, particularly those that are historically marginalized, which is why today I am particularly thrilled to be here talking with Cathy Albisa, who is the executive director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. It's very long, but called NESRI. And Mia Charlene White, who is the assistant professor of public engagement here at the New School. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So, Cathy, you are announcing an exciting new initiative. So can you tell us what the name of that initiative is and why it's needed at this particular moment?
The initiative is called the New Social Contract, and we have to step back a moment, or we step back a moment, and we realize that at this moment in time, people who are deeply concerned with equity, with human rights, with the state of our democracy, and our ranks are swelling, right? There's more of us every day. As a whole, we've all become increasingly aware of the need to be able to truly articulate a clear alternative to the social, political, and economic model within which we have been living for decades. We can't just go back because the model we've been using is what got us into this mess to begin with. We need to think about where were the flaws in that model, how do we rethink it, and how do we move forward? You can't just resist, right? You have to build an opposition. You can't just push back. You have to be able to move forward. But you can't move forward if you don't have a goal, if you don't have a vision. And as you said, you know that we couldn't agree more on this. We know that the solutions are already being tested and tried in communities and worker efforts across the country. We know movements are being built up from those efforts. And those solutions, when you take a really good look at them, are the building blocks of a new way forward. The whole adds up to far more than the sum of its parts. And what this project hopes to do is share them, engage in discussion about them, step into that larger conversation about where do we go next after this very difficult moment and after our resistance turns into the kind of opposition we need.
And what are some of the major what are some of the major elements of the particular New Social Contract? The full name is New Social Contract, Transformative Solutions Built by and for Communities. So what are some of the major elements of it?
Right. So before there, we believe that if you look at all the solutions that the most progressive, the most inventive, the most imaginative, and the most practical groups are pushing forward, they all sit on sort of three legs of the proverbial stool. But before I even name them, I just want to be clear. Although we're calling the project a new social contract, we can't think of a social contract the way we did 100 years ago, with the idea that this is just between an individual and government. It's a far more complex world. We can't think of a social contract as something that we can come to without first reimagining power relations, right? Because you can't reach agreement or consensus when you have such a deep imbalance of power, which is what, again, got us into this mess to begin with. But we're using the term because we think we need a new form of consensus. And the consensus that we see emerging from sites of struggle, as people call it, from marginalized communities that are actually succeeding even now, is one, that we need universal solutions that target and center those with the greatest needs. Right now we have a very fragmented policy framework and economy. But we need solutions that work for everyone. They have to start, though. The design has to begin from those that have the greatest needs. We also need an economic, social, and political system that's actually guided by values and not by the concentration of profit and wealth, Right now, we have some social welfare policy that is supposed to meet human need, but the bulk of our social organization is actually geared to concentrating profit and wealth, and that is usually through very oppressive means. Criminalization being one of the tools, right, to help us concentrate profit and wealth. So we need to be guided by values. We say human rights values, you can say social justice values, but the point is we need to be guided in all our policy and other decisions by values that are human-centered. And the third is we need to transform, revive, and save our sense of democracy in this country. So it's guided by values, structured through this targeted universalism, but driven through a much more inclusive and participatory democracy.
And so why, from the perspective of space, Mia, and as a person who studies space communities, as a former grant maker, focused on social justice, why do you think that this initiative is important at this moment?
Hi. Thank you, Imara. Thank you, Cathy. You are so wise, and I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you both. Why this project? Well, first, I want to say I am a faculty here at the New School, and I'm grateful to be able to be an educator for students here who seek some sort of radical consciousness building. But I can't speak for every single person here at the New School. But as a faculty in the Schools for Public Engagement, what we really want to do is to link with work like yours, because we are in a crisis, an ongoing, meant to be, baked into the system crisis of consciousness, an ethical and moral crisis. We see that at Starbucks. We see that at Harvard with the brother who was naked in the street and people called 911 on him. I mean, it's unrelenting. So why does this work excite me? This work excites me because we recognize the crisis as a crisis that was meant to maim and harm so many of us. Those of us who were, I like to say, I'm borrowing this from another radical scholar, historically looted. So those of us who have been historically looted do need to be centered, right? Targeted as we think about universalism. Those of us who have been historically looted need to be centered in our sort of frameworks for any kind of theory of change. So, yes, before I came back to academia, I worked in social change philanthropy. Fraught experience, and I learned a lot. And what I learned is that there are, as you would say, good-hearted people, right? So-called progressive people who have money and want to know how they can contribute to transformation, societal transformation. And that is the beginning of the conversation. Basically, that's reorienting how people think about their money and their role, and really about capitalism. These themes that Cathy laid out, for me, add up in my own theorization and my own pedagogy to us rethinking capitalism and rethinking how we engage with the state and really how important each of us is. We have to start to think that we are actually important to each other and that we are each other's sanctuary. And when we think that way, then the public policy can follow, in that regard.
One of the things that I think is really important, and what I want to turn to now, we'll get to the ideas in a minute, but those will be laid out over the next year and in a big event on May 24th, which we can talk about on the website in a lot of different ways. So, but one of the things I think that, touching upon what you were saying in terms of the depth of the crisis at the moment, is that there can be a sense of hopelessness because the machinery of the economic system that we have is so has such inertia, it has such momentum, it has such force behind it, that the layers of oppression seem to be so tremendous and so great. But one of the things that I've just observed from my own reading of history is that true change that's revolutionary, not always violent, but revolutionary, big change, comes when people have a sense of what they're fighting for, not necessarily what they're fighting against. As long as there's not an alternative vision, that adds to the sense of hopelessness. So I'm wondering, the ideas that you have contained in this, if taken to scale, you believe will lead to that change. And how so, from a systemic point of view?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer because you sort of hit on at least two big themes. One is this sense of, can we make change right now, given how difficult things are? I couldn't agree with you more. You make real change when you know what you're fighting for. And when there is a crisis, you have what I sometimes call a propertunity, right? Yes, our problems are huge, but it also brings opportunity to address what have been long-standing problems that have now broken through to the surface in a way that make them unsustainable. So change happens when you know what you're fighting for, when you have that opportunity, when there's that opening, that moment of instability. You know it in your personal life. You only change when not changing becomes more painful than changing, because change is hard. And at this point, not changing is clearly more painful than changing. So it is a opportunity on a broad level. And when you have, and I'll now quote one of our partners, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, when you have consciousness plus commitment. They always say consciousness plus commitment equals change. And so I'll use them as an example of possibility. Farm workers in this country are the most exploited workforce there is. And yet they have transformed, and this will be one of the solutions we lift up in the report that comes out with our event on May 24th. They have transformed the most exploitive labor conditions in the country into one of the best sectors for agriculture. So in that, the Florida agriculture was ground zero for modern-day slavery, as described by the Department of Justice. Over many years, there were cases brought for forced labor. Over 1,500 people were freed. Several people went to jail. That was the conditions in the field. But by organizing, by having a vision about how you change power relationships in their supply chains, in 2014, the New York Times described it as one of the best workplaces for low-wage workers. So this is just one of the many examples that we will be lifting up. But the point is, when there is crisis, there is also opportunity. When there is vision, there is real possibility. And when there is commitment in that mix, you get change. So I do think that, on the contrary, now is the moment. And that's why we are all responsible for trying to contribute to building that alternative vision and respecting the people that have been fighting for so long, not just in this moment, but have been fighting the crisis for decades, respecting their experience, their success, and their expertise, because they have demonstrated how we can move forward under the most difficult circumstances.
Mia, I want to hear your thoughts, but I just also want to tell people that if you have questions, please begin to post some of those comments in the Facebook Live, and we will put them to these two as you put them up. So what do you have to say about that?
Again, loved everything Cathy said. I'm just grateful to be in conversation with you again. And look, we have so much to look forward to and to be grateful for. All people matter, right? Although this is not going to turn into one of those conversations. All lives matter. But all people matter. But let's face it, Black, brown, indigenous, queer, trans, undocumented, and refugee people are amazing people. Poor white people, they too are amazing people. They have been able to persist when every government policy has been set up to either maim, annihilate, or persistently exploit them. So, or keep them to bare life standards, right? And this set of people, which is a real cross-section of humanity around the world, continues to persist and make joy and point out the ways that we should be helping each other, right? So, I mean, if those of us are able to get up every morning and with some difficulty, right? Life is difficult, right? But if those people can get up every morning, we have everything to look forward to. So, my perspective is, there is a set of nightmares we need to contend with, right? The ghosts of consciousness that have been baked into our Constitution and various public policies historically, right? But the story doesn't end simply by recognizing the nightmare. We have very many models, especially Black feminist models, but all kinds of models for understanding how to transform that nightmare into knowledge for moving forward, actionable moving forward plans, right, that organize us and sustain us spiritually, sustain us relationally with each other. So, yes, it's a difficult set of nightmares that we continue to wrestle with. And there are ghosts all around us, right? But we know how to transform these things because we've been doing it every day, right? So it is absolutely, yes, a continued hopeful force that animates my work, and that sounds like animates, Cathy's work as well. But it's definitely a productive tension. We need to face the reality and also recognize how we continue to fight despite that reality, right? For a new imaginary, a new tomorrow, even a new today, even a new right now moment, right? I mean, I'm so inspired by certain books I continue to mention on and on. My students will be rolling their eyes at me at this point. But there's a wonderful book that many of you may know, that y'all may know, Christina Sharp, on Blackness. And, it is such an incredible work that thinks about this idea of the wake. We are in the wake of slavery, and we are in, like a ship's wake, in the wake of white supremacy, in the wake of capitalism, yet we continue to engage in wake work, right? Which is like when you celebrate somebody's death and you transform, right? You're grieving, but you're also transforming together in community, because you don't attend a wake by yourself. A wake is always a community experience. So all the models that Cathy has been talking about that are community based, that's wake work. And we know how to do that. We know how to engage in this wake work. And the task is to translate that wake work into public policy.
So we've gotten several comments, and many people want us to get to the solutions, which we will do. We'll turn to that in just a minute, because I think that that's important. That's actually where we're going to end the conversation, because we want to frame the problem, but then also, of course, end on solutions. But a string of comments are about the fact that the root of the problem, will be an interesting question for you, is that the root of the problem is the two-party system. It's not systemic issues in the economy. It's not systemic issues in the justice system. It's not other systemic issues. That if we get rid of the two-party system, if we somehow change the rules of the game politically, then everything else will magically fix itself. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, magic is beautiful. The problem with magic is that it's grounded in misdirection. And has you look in one place while the trick happens over here.
That's right.
And and there are problems with the two-party system. There's no question of that. But I don't think we can fool ourselves that there's one formula, right? We really need to come at this from multiple angles. It's not who we get in office. For example, Nixon ended hunger, and Clinton, the Democrat, ended welfare. That doesn't mean who we get in office doesn't matter, but it's not enough. We really have to look at this from if there are a lot of roots that are toxic, we need to look at all the roots if we're going to build a new forest, right? Not a perfect metaphor, but you get me. And I think part of it is also just our fundamental model, not just our two-party system. Our two-party system is part of that model. But our model of democracy, which is a little bit detached, the representational democracy model, it's not sufficiently participatory, it's not sufficiently inclusive, it's not equitable, it's not pluralistic, but also our economic models. People have been talking about the public-private model. It's not really public-private, because it's not me and my home and the government, right? It's a corporation. It's the public-corporate model. And we need to move that to a public-social model where the power is grounded in communities, where we have community control, and the public supports that, rather than backing what is, in essence, become a corporate state, rather than a real democracy. So I don't think that there is one magic entry point. I think that is why we need to learn from the wide range of movements and communities that have been succeeding, that are principled, but also practical. And what we need right now is a deep, pragmatic idealism that gets us not only out of where we are, but into something that is truly transformational and aligned with the kind of values that our movements have been talking about for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, is that the ideas that you're having, some people were saying, oh, these are people who are talkivist and not talkivist activists. But the most important thing about these ideas is that they actually have been tested, they are actually working, they have been piloted, that these are ideas that and transformations that are actually taking place, and that the point of the entire initiative,
now.
right, and the point of the initiative is actually to spotlight how they're doing that, and the way, if taken to scale and put together, they can actually lead to some sort of massive change. So, and on that point, in your answer also, why don't you take us through some of what you think are the major ideas?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take you through some of the categories because there's 12 strategies and it's only one Facebook Live. But I'll take you sort of the larger categories, and then I'll let Mia kind of dig down in her area of expertise, which is community land trust.
Right.
So the categories we've sort of identified based on our own work with partners, but also just the good fortune of watching the work of a lot of other wonderful groups in the field are the following. One is, how do we change public financing and revenue? So you have everything from the 100-year battle, which we are going to win because we're never going to stop fighting, for universal health care financing, which is an example of risk solidarity, right? We need more risk solidarity in our society, and we need more public financing for public goods. And there are many movements that are pushing in that direction, and they have principles and models as to how that can work. So that ranges, again, from everything from these large national movement for universal health care to small UBI experiments,
What's UBI?
universal basic income experiments,
What's that?
to, well, when we guarantee that everyone has a basic income, a sort of unconditional cash transfer.
The way
There-
corporations have a UBI.
yeah, and there are questions around how do we do that equitably? How do we make sure that it doesn't become a trade-off between targeted programs? How do we, how does that relate to other big ideas like federal jobs guarantees? But there are serious conversations happening around those. And then how do we do revenue? Tax is a social justice issue. We know from the last plan that was devastating that our tax system is one of the things that drives inequity. Not only because we're not taxed equitably, but because we also aren't taxed in a way that encourages positive social action and discourages speculation. On the contrary, speculation is rewarded. And I think social movements are getting far more sophisticated about tax issues. You have the historical fight against property tax as a base for education, which leads to inequitable funding. That was a multi-decade fight. You saw some real successes in Kentucky, for those who are interested, for some years. And when you have solidarity, risk solidarity and financing around education, Kentucky's a great case study, outcomes go up. And when you don't, educational outcomes come down. You have Baltimore right now is fighting for increased taxes on speculation. Big hedge funds buying distressed mortgages, flipping the homes, they should be taxed much higher than they are because we want to discourage that kind of activity. And we want to use those taxes to create permanently affordable housing. So that's one area. The other area is, how does private financing work? It's not working very well. I'll give a shout out to one of our allies, Transform Finance. They've been working on how you rethink all of private financing. Right now, it doesn't follow need at all. It doesn't follow social goals at all. Do we need public banking? Probably. Where we have it, it actually works. Do we need more community banking? Definitely. We have movements calling for postal banking so that we actually have some control over our own capital. That's another category of solutions that we'll be exploring. Land and energy. Land is one of the most speculative parts of our economy imaginable. The fact that we had a housing bubble and a huge economic meltdown should be no surprise. We've set it up for that. It's a cycle that happens over and over again. But land should not be speculative. You should not buy a piece of land at absolutely no value, sit on it, not use it, and then flip it. That does not add value to any community, not really. So there are lots of movements, and there's 200 community land trusts around the country already functioning. That comes out of the civil rights movement, actually. The first community land trust was in Northeast Georgia. And that's another issue that Mia will talk more about, but movements have really been pushing. Community control of land, housing, energy. You talk about electricity co-ops all over the United States have been functioning for more than 100 years as well. And there's a movement for those. They call it public power. It works. Guess what? It works better than private investors providing electricity. You get more electricity for less money and more commitment to green energy. So we know it works. This is not talk what did you call it? Talkivism?
No, I didn't call it. Someone
right.
on Facebook
Called
called
it, right.
Talktivist activist.
Exactly.
I want to talk to that person.
Yeah, no. I'm saying these are things that are actually working in models all over the country. And some of them have been working a long time, some of them we're trying to grow, and some of them are new. We also know our labor system is a catastrophe. I already mentioned the supply chain work through the Fair Food Program that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers are doing, but we really need to rethink accountability in supply chains because right now there isn't any. And low-wage labor is a lawless space. The rule of law has broken down entirely. There is no enforcement. But we also have to think about how to grow worker co-ops. And we have to back federal jobs guarantees, which movements have also been calling for. Together with rethinking trade, these are all things that are in the Movement for Black Lives platform, for example. There is a way to transform labor that would in no way undermine our productivity. On the contrary, co-ops are actually more productive. It'll grow our productivity. And when you bring accountability into supply chains, you actually grow your productivity as well. We have evidence to that effect. And finally, we have to change our processes and culture. I'll give a shout out to all the partners and allies we work with in the Dignity in Schools campaign that have been fighting the school to prison pipeline for so long. They have a vision that we can create a world grounded in restorative justice. And that's a very different world than a world grounded in punitive, criminalizing environments. And the only way we can get to creating a more participatory and inclusive democracy is if we radically decriminalize, we reorganize how we engage with one another, and we are grounded in values of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a way of dealing with conflict, dealing with norms and expectations that is about repairing and deepening relationships, not just about punishment. So those are that's a lot. Those are the broad categories, but let me hand it over for you for more detail. Or do you?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think two things before Mia talks about community land trust, which I think are an essential conversation right now, is that a part of the skepticism and the derision is the fact that the ideas that you're talking about that some have been functioning for hundreds of years don't get talked about, don't get focused on, and that the fact that there are solutions that aren't talked about because they're not going to benefit corporations in a certain way is actually a part of the issue, right? So I think that a part of the, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but part of the ignorance, and I don't mean that in terms of stupidity, but I mean literally in terms of lack of information, is funded by, or is underscored by the fact that we don't actually also have public media, that we have private media, that corporations pay for that media, and it's not necessarily in anyone's interest to talk about, worker co-ops,
And sometimes the obstacles aren't immediately clear because they're created in this very technocratic way.
That's true.
So an example for community land trust is you can't actually sell secondary mortgages on the current market for community land trust the way you do for a private home. That's a structural impediment.
That's true.
To a model that's been proven to work, to a model where lower income homeowners have more stability, gain more equity over time than they do in the private market. But I'll let you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, so rich. So where to start? First, I just want to pivot real quick to the comment that you referenced about the two-party system. This is just my opinion, but you could have 3, 4, 5, 12 parties. And if voting happens on a Tuesday between 7 and 5 p.m. or whatever it is, 7, 8 p.m., basically that's a sham, okay? Because it doesn't matter how many parties you have. If you're setting it up to exclude people, then I don't care really how many parties you have. 0, 10, whatever it is. That basically the way that the United States has been set up, its electoral system, its representational system, is really meant to benefit a certain subset of the population. I mean, this is just a fact. So if we want to think about a multi-party system, I'm down. But then we also have to think about restructuring the way that we even understand voting, right? Why does it have to be on one day? Why do you need to show a government issue, et cetera and so forth? So anyway, that's not totally my lane, but I just felt like I wanted to address that question that somebody raised. Yeah. In terms of community land trust, land and energy, I love that you referenced that the first CLT came out of the civil rights movement, and that is so important. I think I feel like a broken record. I say that all the time. The first one was started by Slater King, Martin Luther King's cousin. And it comes out of the Albany movement, which is a racial justice, which is a spatial justice, which is a human rights movement. And it's not without contradictions. Okay, so let's put it this way: I teach about community land trusts and co-ops because I think that they generate so much potential and so much transformation. Yet at the same time, we also have to recognize a couple of things. We continue to exist on stolen indigenous land. A, B. Slater King went to Jerusalem to meet with the Jewish National Fund to learn about, cooperative land management, and that was a highly political and continues to be a set of socio-spatial relationships, right? That he then, with others, wanted to reframe for the purposes of Black land, which is, Black land matters more. I feel I need a T-shirt that says that. So we have to hold these contradictions a little bit, simultaneously, which is difficult for people to do. So before I get into, some things about the CLT, I do want to say that from an educator's perspective and also as a researcher, but I teach 5 classes a year, so I'm an educator. As an educator, I will say that we don't teach our students or ourselves, certainly we weren't taught, to hold contradictions simultaneously and then not to give up hope because there are contradictions built into the system. We are simply existentially, intellectually, spiritually, we have very little skills, anemic set of skills around how to hold contradictions, not give up, keep moving forward, keep pressing forward, keep moving forward. Don't throw people away. Nobody is trash. How do we keep moving forward? And I feel like that certainly exists when we think about anything related to space. So whether it's the first space, our embodied space, who do we get to be, how are we understood, whether it's institutions, a second space of institutions, the Federal Housing Authority, or the Homestead Act, which stole all that land from indigenous people and suddenly made white men homeowners, right? Or the third space of politics, which is really, I think, some of what we've been talking about. We really need to kind of hold ourselves accountable, but not throw each other away when we do that. So our educational system is kind of broken because what we're doing is testing each other or our students on how to regurgitate other people's greatness and not tap into our deepest imaginations and our deepest hopes and drives, which is really for all of us to belong. All of us are trying to belong somehow, right? And we need to physically belong somewhere because of physics and gravity, right? We need to physically be able to be somewhere. Why I really like community land trusts and co-ops, yes.
Everyone
Okay.
might not know exactly what they are. So why don't you
Oh,
first explain
okay.
what they are?
Thank you. So community land trusts are a different way of linking a relationship between housing and land, right? So right now, part of the problem with speculation and a traditional mortgage is that the land becomes this like fast cash, fast speculation methodology for making money, right? And so it's sort of like it's like taking nature and chopping it up into dollars, right? So what the community land trust wants to do is take the land out of that fast web of conversion speculation. So, and how does it do that? So the community land trust model, again, started by Slater King back in Albany, Georgia. Shout out to Albany, Georgia, which I was there this summer. Is a community-based organization holds the land, okay? So the community, through the avatar of a community-based organization, yes, community-based organizations can be shady, so it's fraud. So we hold the contradictions, but a community-based organization holds the land, and individuals, right, can own property through an extended lease. In other words, an agreement, an arrangement, and a relationship with the community-based organization. We can own the property, the structure on the land, okay? So this changes the dynamic in many different ways. This brings down the cost of the structure because we took the cost of the land out of the equation, right? Because the community-based organization owns the land, right? Have we solved indigenous theft of land? No. So we have to hold these contradictions, okay? But we are trying to directly confront speculative capitalism through the mortgage construct, through a community land trust ownership model.
And then there's the resale formula, right?
The resale formula means, and this is where people get a little bit edgy. Okay, so the resale formula means that if Cathy, if you were all, part of a community land trust and she has a home on a community land, a CLT, and she wants to sell her CLT property, she will be able to sell it, but not at market rate. In other words, she is not going to suddenly come into $600,000. She's going to get some percentage of, she'll get all the money she put into her home. So if she paid for a new air conditioner and she paid for a new refrigerator, all of that will be recouped traditionally under the CLT model, but she's not going to, come out with 600,000, whatever it is. It's going to be capped at some percentage, something, I think the average is like 20 to 25% of market. And the reason, right, is because we want another Cathy to come through, right? And also, we're trying to be efficient. All of these various, credits that we have to cobble together to make a CLT, a community land trust possible, we don't want it to just go all out the window, and then now we have to go hustle for 1,200 different kinds of, credits to make this possible for the next Cathy. So we want to, in perpetuity, support every version of this Cathy and the next Cathy coming through in terms of affordability. So this is where people get a little bit edgy. They're like, wait a minute, you're telling me that I can't sell this property on the market? Isn't that, aren't you keeping us down? It's like, well, it depends on how you frame the problem. Is the problem just about you being kept down, or is the problem a collective problem where as a set of people, we are more focused on our individual gain and not about the next Cathy's coming through, right? So how you problematize the thing, orients the stories that you can tell about it, right? Mm-hmm. So we need to reframe the problem a little bit. The problem is not just about how much money Mia can make. The problem is about at the level of the community, how we have homeless people, how we have seniors without a place to stay, how we have single moms without a place to stay, how we continue to have all this speculation, how there's a wave of gentrification since the mortgage was invented for white men that we need to fight. So I just want to say one other thing about energy. There's a fantastic black electric cooperative in North Carolina that's doing some incredible work, right? And what they're able to do is stop the so-called brain drain of young black folks leaving the South because they're like, well, what do you want me to do for work? Right. And supporting young people to become those who are going into homes and upgrading homes, retrofitting homes, retrofitting the insulation in homes, and using really forward-thinking methodologies like hemp, for instance, which a lot of my students know. I'm so down with hemp. No, you can't smoke hemp. Hemp is an incredible insulator, okay? You can't burn it once it's been created into insulation. It's water resistant. It's an amazing, healthy, if we had homes made of these materials, we would have carbon sinks. Imagine we have 350 million people in the United States. Imagine 10% of those domiciles were made out of homes with these sustainable materials. We would have carbon neutral homes sucking carbon out of the air that we could actually afford. We could put people back to work. So we have models, is my long-winded point, from community-based efforts like this Black Electric Cooperative in North Carolina that is putting people back to work in a way that preserves dignity, Black space, right, that is affordable and that's forward-thinking. It's so forward-thinking. It's community-based and forward-thinking. It's collective. So I'll stop there. I've been talking too long.
And I just to add, in the simplest terms, one of the things, like with a model like Community Land Trust, is one, it's very stable. People don't leave. You have communities that have been community land trusts for decades, and you don't have the kind of displacement and the kind of turning over that makes it hard to actually build community. And two, because the community as a whole is responsible for the land in the neighborhood, what you do is you build local democracy, right? So that's the other important thing.
Yeah, let me say one more thing about that after you talk.
Okay.
Just one more thing. I was just at the Black Policy Conference at Harvard this Saturday, and we talked about community land trust, and I was in the ED for Dudley Square. Tony was on the panel, and he was providing the stat that foreclosures on Dudley property, community land trust property is at 0.18. Nationally for community land trust, foreclosures is at 0.35. Okay? So if you look at a map, you see all these red dots, foreclosures all around a CLT property, but not on a CLT property. And that's because you can't go in there with a subprime. You can't go in with that subprime hustle at the level of a community protecting property. And that's what we need.
Well, you have to get the class. And we are close to being time on this. Of course, there's so much to talk about that we could go on actually for many, many, many more hours. But that's one of the reasons why this is a year-long project, right? Where you'll be, or more, where you're rolling these ideas out over time. And do you want to say one last thing about the event itself and some of the co-sponsors that are going to kick it off on May 24th?
Yes, I think it's going to be, we have some amazing people coming together here at the New School, and I want to thank the New School for partnering with us on this project. We have Carol Anderson coming, who is the author of White Rage, and she's going to talk about human rights and the history of human rights and movements. She will be in conversation with Greg Asbed, one of the co-founders of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and a recent MacArthur Genius Award winner, which we're very proud of. We have Glenn Harris, the president of Race Forward, with a long history in bringing equity to local institutions and local government. We're very, very lucky to have him as well, in conversation with Nijmi Durinsinko. Oh my God, Nijmi, you're going to kill me. I can't remember how to pronounce your last name, and I know how much you hate that. But she is a leader at Put People First Pennsylvania, and she has been building fascinating new models of organizing, connecting urban communities and rural communities across the state. We will also be having James Haslam of Rights and Democracy, who was spearheaded the successful and although stalled and still working on healthcare campaign in Vermont. And we will be having you. These are all our speakers. We will be talking about this larger framework and really just kicking off the project. Maya Wiley will be opening the event. She's here, Vice President at the New School. And we really encourage people to come. We'll be honoring Michael Ratner, who was an early supporter of Nesri, and we're going to have a reception in his honor because part of his legacy has been sort of moving forward radical ideas. And we hope to bring together some pretty interesting people. Thanks.
Yeah, and I also think that People's Action, our sponsor, right? Resource Generation, and also Race Forward. So all of those sort of partners and connections are on the website, Nesri website, where you can go and click on more information for a new social contract. So now we really are out of time because you really do have to get to class. But I wanted to thank you both for joining us, and thank you for your leadership on this and for all of the work that Nesri does through its initiatives in communities across the country that have helped to spearhead this. You and I have been talking sort of offline for almost a year about this particular idea, and to see it now be a reality is exciting. So thank you so much for doing this and for having us, and go find out about a new social contract and pay attention to it over the next year.